The sky was filled with fire. Bright beams of light shot across the dark clouds, and the ground shook with every blast. Captain Elias Ward stood behind a piece of broken metal, watching as the battle raged on around him. His soldiers were tired, their armor scratched and burnt, but they kept fighting. This was Velara Ax, the last planet where humans and the alien race called Velari were still fighting. After years of war, both sides were desperate to win. Elias wiped the sweat from his face and looked around. His radio crackled, and a voice called, "Captain Ward, we need backup on the east side." Elias picked up his rifle and replied, "Hold your ground. I'm on my way." As he moved through the battlefield, smoke and dust filled the air. The ground was littered with broken machines and fallen soldiers, both human and Velari. The sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, mixed with the strange humming of Velari energy weapons. Elias had fought the Velari for years. They were strong, fast, and used powerful technology. But humans had something different: courage and determination. And Elias believed that would make the difference. Suddenly, a sharp sound made him turn. From behind a pile of rubble, a Velari warrior stepped out, her armor glowing blue. She looked at him with bright silver eyes, and in her hand was a long, sharp blade that shimmered in the dim light. Elias raised his rifle, ready to fire. But then he paused. The Velari warrior was wounded. Her left arm hung limply, and her side was bleeding. She could barely stand. But still, she pointed her blade at him, her face full of pride and anger. For a moment, they stared at each other. Enemies, both tired, both knowing that only one of them might walk away. Elias's finger rested on the trigger, but something stopped him. She was young, maybe not much older than 20. And though she was an enemy, there was something in her eyes. Fear, pain, and something else. Hope. Slowly, Elias lowered his rifle. "Go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't need to die today." The Velari woman looked shocked. She blinked, as if she couldn't believe what she heard. Elias took a step back and waved his hand. "Go." She stood still for a moment, then dropped her blade and turned, running away into the smoke. Elias watched her disappear. He didn't know why he let her go. Maybe because he was tired of seeing death. Maybe because he saw in her eyes that she didn't really want to fight anymore. Suddenly, his radio came alive again. "Captain, the Velari are retreating on the east side. We're pushing them back." Elias took a deep breath. "Good," he answered, but his mind was still on the Velari woman. As he walked back toward his unit, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Why did I let her go? He asked himself. Was it a mistake? But deep inside, he felt it was the right thing to do. Later that night, as the human soldiers gathered around small fires, resting and talking quietly, Elias sat alone, looking up at the stars. The sky was calm now, but he knew the war was not over. Still, for the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope. He thought about the Velari woman he had spared. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that she was more important than he could ever imagine. A princess, the key to peace between their worlds. But that secret would wait for another day. For now, Elias only knew one thing. Sometimes, mercy was more powerful than a weapon. And perhaps in that moment of kindness, the first step toward ending the war had been taken. As the fires burned low and the soldiers fell asleep, Elias sat in silence, watching the stars, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The morning sun rose over the wreckage of Velara Ix. The battlefield from the night before was quiet now, save for the sounds of soldiers preparing for the next phase of the war. The human forces had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Captain Elias Ward stood at the edge of the encampment, his thoughts still on the Velari woman he had spared the night before. He had ordered his men to search for any survivors, but he hadn't expected to find her again. Yet, as he walked past a row of prisoner tents, he heard a voice. "Captain Ward." He turned around and saw Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, his second in command. She looked concerned, holding a data pad in her hand. "Sir, you need to see this." Elias raised an eyebrow and followed her to a nearby tent. Inside, the woman from the night before was sitting, her hands bound, her face calm but tired. She was no longer in her armor. Instead, she wore simple clothes, a dark blue tunic that matched the Velari military's colors. Her silver eyes met Elias's, and for a brief moment there was a flash of recognition between them. Elias nodded at her. "You're the one I saved." The woman didn't say anything at first. Instead, she glanced around the tent, as if searching for something or someone. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice calm but curious. She studied him for a long time before answering. "I am Silani, daughter of King Joran, ruler of Velara." Elias stared at her in shock. He had never expected this. He had spared the life of a royal princess without knowing it. "You're the princess?" he asked, his voice low. Silani nodded. "I was sent to Velara IX to understand humanity before my father decided what to do with your people, but everything has gone wrong." Elias ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what she had just said. He had heard rumors about the Velari royal family, but he never imagined he would meet one of them in person, especially in the middle of a battle. "You don't seem like the others," Elias said after a long pause. "The Velari soldiers, they fight without mercy. But you didn't want this, did you?" Silani's eyes softened, and for the first time, a small hint of emotion flickered across her face. "No, I never wanted any of this. My father, he believes in the old ways of war, but I see something different in you. You spared me, even when you could have killed me. Why?" Elias paused, thinking carefully about his answer. "I don't know. Maybe because I've seen enough death. Maybe because I saw something in your eyes. You're not like the others. You didn't look like a soldier, just someone trapped in the middle of something bigger than themselves." Silani looked away for a moment, her gaze distant. "I am trapped, but it's not just the war that traps me. It's my role, my title. I am the heir to the throne, but I don't know if I can be the queen my people need. My father wants to crush your people, but I believe there's a better way." Elias was quiet for a long time, thinking about her words. He had always thought of the Velari as enemies, strangers who had invaded Earth and brought war. But now, faced with this woman, this princess who seemed so different from the soldiers he fought against, his perspective was beginning to shift. "What happens now?" he asked. Silani's voice was soft. "I don't know. My people will come for me. They will want to make an example of me. And your people, they won't want to negotiate with me. I'm a prisoner. I'm not even supposed to be here." Elias felt a sense of responsibility he hadn't expected. He had saved her life, and now he couldn't just turn away. The more he listened to her, the more he realized she wasn't just another enemy. She was a person who wanted peace, just like he did. "I'll protect you," Elias said firmly. Silani's eyes widened in surprise. "You would do that? After everything?" Elias nodded. "I don't know what will happen next, but I can't just leave you here. If you believe there's a way to stop this war, I'll help you find it." For a moment, Silani looked at him in silence, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke. I think there's a chance. If I can get back to my people, I can stop the fighting. But it's dangerous. My father and his generals won't trust me anymore. They'll see me as weak." Elias placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll make sure they see you as something else, a leader, someone who can end this war." Silani nodded slowly. Maybe you're right." As Elias turned to leave the tent, he knew one thing for sure. His world had just gotten a lot more complicated. He was no longer just a soldier fighting for his planet. He was now a protector of someone who could change the future of both their worlds. But he couldn't do it alone. They needed each other. And perhaps, just perhaps, together, they could find a way to stop the war before it consumed everything. The day after their conversation, Elias stood in the quiet command tent, staring at the map of Velara IX. He could hear the distant hum of soldiers preparing for another push, the sound of boots marching across the dirt. Yet his mind was far from the war outside. He was thinking about Silani, the Velari princess he had spared. He had promised to protect her, but he was still unsure of how to proceed. How could a human soldier like him keep a royal alien safe from her own people? The more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. Captain Ward. Elias turned to see Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, her face tight with concern. She was holding a data pad in her hand, the screen flashing with information. "There's something you need to see." Elias nodded and followed her to the far side of the tent. He watched as Sarah tapped on the pad, bringing up an image of a Velari warship, its sleek form gliding through space. "The Velari fleet is approaching," Sarah said. "It's bigger than we expected. They're not just sending reinforcements, they're sending everything." Elias looked at the screen, his heart sinking. The ship was massive, its design sharp and cold, the kind of war machine that could wipe out entire cities with ease. "But why?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Why are they coming now? If they're planning a full invasion, why haven't they attacked yet?" Sarah shook her head. "We don't know, but it's clear that something is about to happen." Before Elias could respond, the tent flap opened, and Silani entered, her expression calm but serious. Elias had noticed the quiet confidence she carried with her now. Something had shifted in her, and he could tell she was no longer just the princess who had been trapped in a war she didn't want. "The Velari fleet is on its way," Elias said. "Do you know why?" Silani's eyes flickered briefly with something Elias couldn't quite place. "I suspected as much," she said softly. "My father does not take kindly to betrayal." Elias frowned. "Betrayal?" She nodded, stepping closer to the map. "When I was sent to the front lines, it was not only to learn about humanity. It was to decide whether or not Earth would be destroyed. But my mission was secret. Only a few knew I was even here. If my father discovers that I've been captured, he will see it as a direct challenge to his authority. He will come to crush me, and to ensure that no other Velari question his power." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "So he's coming to kill you?" "Yes," Silani said simply. "But it's not just me he's after. He'll want to crush any chance of peace with your people. He believes that the Velari way of ruling is the only way, and that humanity will never be anything more than enemies to us." Elias clenched his fists. He had known the Velari were ruthless in battle, but the idea of a king willing to destroy his own daughter to protect his power made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a war for land. It was a battle for control, for the future of two species. "You have to leave," Elias said quickly, his mind racing. "We need to get you out of here before your father arrives." Silani shook her head. "There is no escape now. If I run, my people will see me as weak. And worse, they will see you as the enemy. I have to face them." Elias stared at her, his chest tightening. She had always been strong, but this was something different. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a leader, even if she didn't yet know how to lead. "We can fight back," Elias said, his voice firm. "We don't need to wait for them to come to us. We can take the battle to them. If we stand together, we can stop this." Silani's gaze softened as she looked at him. There was a trust in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. "And how do you propose we do that?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Elias smiled, a plan starting to form in his mind. "We have something they don't. Human ingenuity. You said your father doesn't believe in peace. Well, maybe we can show him the power of unity. If we can get to your fleet before they arrive, we can turn the tide. We can show them that humanity doesn't give up." Silani considered his words for a moment before nodding. "It's a risk, but it might be our only chance." "I'm willing to risk everything to stop this war," Elias said. "For Earth, And for you. The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Selani's expression was unreadable, but Elias saw the flicker of emotion in her eyes. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a woman who understood the cost of war and the price of peace. As the two of them stood there, strategizing their next move, Elias knew one thing for certain. The coming battle would decide more than just the fate of a single planet. It would determine the future of two civilizations and the very idea of what it meant to be human. And no matter what it took, Elias would fight for that future. He would fight for peace. The sun had barely risen when Elias and Selani stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the horizon. The distant hum of ships filled the air, signaling the approach of the Velari fleet. Time was running out. Elias turned to Selani, his face set in determination. "We've got one shot at this," he said. "Once your father's fleet arrives, we won't have a chance to make a move. We need to act fast." Selani nodded. Her silver eyes were focused, but Elias could see the worry in them. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She had become someone who understood the heavy burden of leadership. "I know," Selani said quietly. "But if we fail—" "We won't fail," Elias interrupted, his voice firm. "I've seen what humanity is capable of. We've overcome impossible odds before. We can do it again." She looked at him, a spark of hope flickering in her gaze. "You truly believe that?" Elias smiled slightly. "I have to." Selani took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Then let's make this count." Back in the command tent, Elias and Selani laid out their plan on a large map of the area. They would need to reach the Velari fleet before it could land on Velora Ix. The plan was risky, dangerous even, but it was their only hope. "First, we need to disable their communications," Elias said, pointing to a location on the map. "If we can cut off their ability to coordinate, we can buy ourselves some time. That'll give us a chance to get to their flagship and stop the invasion from the inside." Selani studied the map closely, her finger tracing the path Elias had outlined. "The communications hub is well protected, but it's not impossible. If we strike fast and hard, we might be able to get in and out before they realize what's happening." Elias nodded. "That's the idea. We'll need a small team, just a few people who can move quickly and quietly." "And I'll go with you," Selani said without hesitation. Elias glanced at her, surprised. "No, you're too important. If something happens to you—" "I'm not sitting this out," she interrupted, her voice steady. "I've made my choice. My people might see me as weak for not fighting, but I refuse to stand by and let my father destroy everything. I need to be there." Elias could see the fire in her eyes. He understood. Selani wasn't just fighting for herself or her people. She was fighting for the chance of something better. Something that had never seemed possible until now. "All right," Elias said after a long pause. "We'll take you with us, but we need to be careful. If we get caught, everything falls apart." Selani nodded, her expression resolute. "I understand." The team was small. Elias, Selani, Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, and a few of their most trusted soldiers. They moved quickly through the camp, gathering equipment and preparing for the dangerous mission ahead. There was a quiet sense of urgency in the air, but also a strange calm. It wasn't just the weight of the task before them. It was the understanding that they were doing something that had never been done before. As they gathered near the transport ships, Elias pulled Selani aside for a moment. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "This isn't just a mission. It's a gamble. If we fail, we lose everything." Selani looked at him, her expression unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Captain. We've come too far to turn back now." Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded. He had no doubt that Selani was a leader in her own right, even if she didn't yet see it fully. She had strength, courage, and a vision for peace that no one else seemed to understand. With a final nod, Elias turned and led the group toward the waiting ships. As the engines hummed to life and they took off into the sky, Elias couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. The journey to the Velari fleet was tense. The skies above Velora Ix were dark with the shadows of enemy ships, and the air was thick with the sound of war. As they approached the communications hub, Elias's heart raced. This was the moment of truth. "We're almost there," Sarah said, her voice tight over the comms. Elias glanced at Silani, who was seated beside him, her eyes focused on the horizon. "Ready?" he asked. Silani nodded. "Let's do this." The team landed near the communications hub, a towering structure surrounded by Velari soldiers. Elias's mind raced as they disembarked, taking cover behind the nearest rocks. The clock was ticking, and the first wave of Velari soldiers would be arriving soon. "Move quickly," Elias whispered to the team. "We need to get inside before they notice us." Silani moved beside him, her movements silent and precise. Despite her royal upbringing, Elias could see she was no stranger to danger. She was focused, her determination clear. They approached the entrance, carefully avoiding the patrolling guards. As they slipped inside, Elias signaled for the team to split up. They would need to plant explosives in key areas of the communication system to disable it completely. As Elias and Silani moved through the dark corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step felt heavier than the last. He knew they had little time, but there was something else, a sense of purpose that drove them forward. In that moment, Elias realized that this mission wasn't just about stopping a war. It was about forging a future where two worlds could finally understand each other. The silence in the Velari communications hub was almost suffocating. Elias and Silani moved carefully through the dark, cold corridors, their footsteps soft on the smooth floor. The hum of the building's energy systems filled the air, but there was no sign of the Velari soldiers yet. It was the calm before the storm. Elias glanced at Silani, who was walking just behind him. Despite the tension, there was a steady resolve in her eyes. She wasn't the scared princess he had first met on the battlefield. She was a leader now, determined to do whatever it took to stop the war. And Elias couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for her. "We have to plant the explosives in the main control room," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. "That'll disable their communication systems and give us a chance to stop the invasion." Silani nodded, her face serious. "I know. I've seen the control room. It's heavily guarded, but we can do this. We just have to stay focused." They moved forward, weaving through narrow passageways that seemed to stretch on forever. The building was enormous, built with the Velari's advanced technology, but it was also a maze. Elias had studied the layout before their mission, but nothing could prepare them for the tight security they were about to face. "Lieutenant Hayes, what's our status?" Elias whispered into his comm. "We're in position, Captain," came Sarah's voice, calm but tense. "We'll cover the exit once you're in. Just get it done fast." "Understood. Keep your eyes open," Elias replied. He turned to Silani. "We're close now, just a little farther." Silani's grip on her weapon tightened, and for a moment, Elias saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or doubt. He couldn't be sure. But whatever it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. She was back to the calm, determined princess he had come to trust. They rounded a corner and saw the main control room ahead. Two Velari guards stood just outside the entrance, talking quietly to each other. The time to act was now. Elias motioned for Silani to stay low, and they both crouched behind a wall. The guards didn't seem to notice them. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, his fingers brushing against the device he was carrying. The explosives that would disrupt the Velari fleet's entire communication network. "We can take them," Elias whispered. "On my mark." Silani nodded. She moved into position, and Elias signaled her to wait. They both waited for the perfect moment. The guards' backs turned, the sound of their conversation filling the silence. "Now." Elias rushed forward, surprising the guards before they could react. In a flash, he knocked one out, and Scifi took care of the other with a swift, quiet move. Within seconds, the two Velari soldiers were unconscious, lying on the cold floor. "That was too easy," Scifi said quietly, breathing heavily. Elias gave a small, relieved smile. "Luck, I guess." He quickly moved to the control panel and began planting the explosives. Scifi kept watch, her eyes scanning the hallways for any more guards. Elias worked quickly, his hand steady despite the pressure. The countdown timer on the explosives started. "We've got 3 minutes," Elias said, his voice calm but urgent. "Let's get out of here." They moved back down the corridor, retracing their steps toward the exit. The tension in the air was thick now. They had no idea how long it would take the Velari soldiers to discover the sabotage, but they didn't have much time to find out. As they approached the exit, Elias suddenly froze. He could hear footsteps in the distance, heavy and deliberate. The soldiers were coming. "We need to move now," he hissed. Scifi's eyes widened, and she nodded quickly. They both sprinted down the hall, hearts racing. The blast would go off soon, and they had to be far enough away to avoid it. But as they turned a corner, they were met by a group of Velari soldiers, at least 5 of them, all armed and ready. Elias's pulse quickened, but Scifi stepped forward, holding up a hand. "Wait." The soldiers hesitated, unsure of what to do. Scifi took a deep breath and spoke in her native tongue, her voice calm and commanding. "I am Princess Scifi of Velara," she said, her eyes sweeping over the soldiers. "I've come to end the war, not fight you." The soldiers looked at each other, uncertainty clouding their expressions. They had heard of the princess. Some might have even been loyal to her. But now, faced with her in enemy territory, it wasn't clear where their loyalties lay. Scifi continued, her voice steady. "Your king has led us down a path of destruction, but I believe there is another way. You do not have to follow him. We can stop this war." Elias stood behind her, watching the soldiers closely. He knew this was a dangerous gamble. There was no telling if the soldiers would believe her, or if they would decide to follow her and help them escape. For what felt like an eternity, the soldiers were silent. Then one of them, the leader, took a step forward. He was tall and strong, his armor gleaming in the dim light. "I am not sure what to believe, Princess," the soldier said. "But if you are telling the truth, we are with you." A wave of relief washed over Elias. He hadn't expected this, but this was their chance. If they could convince enough of the Velari soldiers to turn against their own king, the invasion could be stopped. "There's no time to explain further," Elias said quickly. "The explosives are set to go off soon. We need to get out of here, now." The soldier nodded, and with his help, they quickly made their way to the exit, just as the countdown hit its final seconds. Elias, Scifi, and the soldiers moved swiftly through the winding hallways of the Velari communications hub. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, but it didn't matter now. The countdown had begun, and they had no time to waste. They had to get out before the explosion triggered and destroyed the building. As they approached the main exit, Elias's heart pounded harder with every step. The blast from the explosives they planted would be enough to disable the entire Velari fleet's communication systems, but it would also bring chaos. They needed to be far enough away to avoid the blast radius. "We're almost there," Elias whispered, his voice low and focused. Scifi nodded, her eyes scanning the hall ahead. The soldiers behind them moved quietly, alert to any danger. It seemed as though they had made it through the most dangerous part of the mission without being noticed, but Elias knew that wouldn't last long. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from behind them. The doors to a side hallway were kicked open, and several Velari soldiers emerged, their weapons raised. Elias cursed under his breath. They were trapped. "Go!" Elias shouted. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Scifi's arm and pulled her toward the exit, but the soldiers were already closing in. One of the soldiers shouted something in the Velari language, and the others rushed forward. It was clear they weren't just here to stop them, they were here to capture them. Elias and Silani dashed toward the exit, but the soldiers were faster. A bullet zipped past Elias, grazing his shoulder. He winced but kept running. "We need to make it to the transport ships," Elias shouted, his voice hoarse. "Stay close." Silani stayed right beside him, her face determined. She didn't need to be told twice. Elias could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on them, but he knew they couldn't slow down now. The soldiers were gaining on them. Elias's breath came in short gasps as they sprinted through the final stretch. They were only a few hundred meters away from the transport ships, but the Velari soldiers were relentless. Elias saw the shuttle ahead, its engines already warm, waiting for them. "We're almost there." Then the explosion went off. The ground beneath their feet shook as if the very world was being torn apart. A bright flash lit up the sky, and a deafening roar filled the air. Elias felt the heat on his back as the shockwave from the blast sent him tumbling forward. "Silani!" Elias shouted, scrambling to his feet. His vision was blurry, and smoke filled the air. He could barely see anything through the dust and debris. "Captain!" Silani's voice cut through the chaos. He turned and saw her, already standing, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to go," she shouted, grabbing his arm. Elias nodded, and together they ran toward the shuttle. The blast had given them a brief opening, but they had to move quickly before more soldiers arrived. As they reached the shuttle, the hatch opened. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes and the other soldiers were already aboard, waiting for them. "Get in," Sarah shouted. They didn't need to be told twice. Elias and Silani leaped into the shuttle, and the door slammed shut behind them. The engines roared to life, and the shuttle shot up into the sky, narrowly avoiding the incoming fire from Velari soldiers on the ground. The noise of the battle outside was deafening, but inside the shuttle, it was strangely quiet. For a few moments, everyone just sat, catching their breath. Elias could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had did out, but that was only the beginning. "Did we succeed?" Silani asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias turned to look at her. Her face was tired, her hair singed from the explosion, but her eyes still held that same fire, determination, hope. He had seen it before, in the way she stood tall even in the face of danger. "We did," Elias said, his voice steady. "The Velari fleet is cut off. They can't communicate with each other anymore. We've bought time." "But for how long?" Silani asked, her gaze moving out the window. The distant glow of the Velari warships loomed in the distance, a reminder that the battle was far from over. Elias looked out with her. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The blast they'd set off would cause chaos in the Velari ranks, but it would also make them desperate. They would fight harder, knowing that their entire communication network had been destroyed. He didn't have an answer to Silani's question, but he wasn't going to give up. They had one chance to make this work, and they couldn't waste time. The shuttle soared higher, breaking through the clouds and into the cold emptiness of space. Elias stared out of the window, his mind racing with possibilities. The war was far from over, but they had a chance now. A chance to end it before it could destroy both their worlds. As the shuttle made its way toward the fleet, Elias felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for something bigger, for peace. The shuttle rocked gently as it moved further into space, the faint light of the distant stars reflecting off the hull. Elias stared out the window, his mind heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The explosion had given them a small victory, but the war was far from over. The Velari fleet was still looming ahead, ready to strike. Beside him, Silani was deep in thought. Her face was pale from the blast, but her resolve hadn't wavered. If anything, the events of the past few hours had only strengthened her determination. "We bought ourselves time," Elias said quietly, breaking the silence. But it won't last long. We need a plan. A real plan. Silani turned to face him, her silver eyes reflecting the same determination he had seen earlier. I know. The Villari fleet won't wait forever. They'll regroup and come after us. Elias nodded. Then we need to take the fight to them. We can't just sit back and wait for them to strike. We can't just charge in blindly. Silani said, her voice steady. We need to weaken their forces from within. We have to find a way to turn their own people against them. Elias looked at her, surprised. You think your father will listen? Silani's expression darkened. I don't know, but if we can get to him, maybe we can show him that the war has to stop, that there is another way. Elias didn't say anything for a moment. The idea of confronting the Villari king directly was dangerous, almost impossible. But it was also the only hope they had. If Silani could reach her father, she might be able to convince him to end the war. But that would take courage and trust. We'll have to move quickly, Elias said, making up his mind. The longer we wait, the more people will die. If we can take the fight to your father, maybe we can end this once and for all. Silani nodded, her voice firm. Then we leave as soon as possible. I won't waste any more time. The shuttle sped toward the Villari fleet, the tension inside thickening with every passing moment. The soldiers aboard were ready, but Elias could see the concern in their eyes. No one knew what the next step would bring. They were heading straight into the heart of the enemy's territory, and they had no way of knowing how the Villari forces would react. As the shuttle neared the main flagship, Elias felt his heart race. This was it, the final moment. Either they succeeded, or everything they had fought for would be lost. We're almost there, Lieutenant Hayes said, her voice calm but strained. Brace yourselves. Elias took a deep breath. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about changing the course of history. We're in range, Hayes said. We're going to dock with the flagship in 30 seconds. The shuttle vibrated as it made contact with the flagship's hull. Elias felt his stomach tighten. This was the moment of truth. The door opened, and they were immediately met by a group of Villari soldiers, their weapons drawn. Stay calm, Elias whispered to Silani. We can do this. But before they could move, one of the soldiers stepped forward. His armor gleamed in the dim light of the docking bay, and his face was a mask of stoic resolve. He didn't look like someone who would hesitate. Princess Silani, the soldier said, his voice low but respectful. You have returned. Silani stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. I have returned to stop this madness, she said, her voice steady. I have come to speak with my father. The soldier hesitated, his expression flickering with uncertainty. Elias could see the doubt in his eyes, but there was no turning back now. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the moment of confrontation. You must come with us, the soldier said, his voice firm. The king is waiting. Elias's heart skipped a beat. This was it. They were being taken directly to the Villari king. They had no choice but to follow, hoping that Silani's words would be enough to sway her father. The soldiers led them through the winding corridors of the flagship. The walls were decorated with intricate designs and alien symbols, a reminder of the Villari's long history. But for all the beauty of the ship, Elias couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were heading straight into the lion's den. As they reached the throne room, the doors slid open, revealing a grand chamber. At the far end, seated on a towering throne, was the Villari king, Silani's father. He was a tall, imposing figure, his eyes cold and calculating. His armor was adorned with symbols of power, a reminder of his status as the ruler of the Villari people. Father, Silani said, stepping forward, it's time to end this war. The king's eyes narrowed. You return, daughter, only to betray your people, he asked, his voice sharp. You have sided with the enemy. Silani stood tall, her expression unshaken. "No, father. I am not betraying our people. I am trying to save them. From you." The king stood up, his figure casting a shadow over the room. "You speak of peace, but you have already chosen your side. You have no place here." Selani's voice was calm, but her words were heavy. "I have a place with my people. I will not stand by while you destroy everything we've worked for. There is another way, father. We can find peace. We can stop this war." The king's face twisted with anger. "You are weak, Selani. You have always been weak. You think they will forgive you for your betrayal. Maybe they will," Selani said softly. "But the only way we can survive is if we stop fighting. The war must end. Now." Elias stood beside her, watching the tension unfold. He had no idea how this would end, but he knew one thing for sure. Selani was stronger than anyone had given her credit for, and no matter what happened next, he would stand with her.